Many other scientists were of the opinion that this should be studied, and they could have done something. And if they had given an opinion to the Secretary of the Air Force that this should be studied, it would have been studied. Instead, everything was swept under the rug.
The Air Force contention that UFOs were not a threat to national security was contradicted over and over by the military's own files. A secret order issued in 1960 to all Air Force commanders stated flat out that the Pentagon considers UFOs to be, quote, serious business, and no wonder. UFOs had been seen most often over sensitive nuclear and military installations, including Oak Ridge National Lab, Los Alamos, White Sands, Savannah River, and dozens of other defense installations.
Anybody would recognize that if you have a base at which there are stored nuclear weapons, and a vehicle has penetrated your air cover and goes right down the runway, that has national security implications. That kind of sighting is far more interesting to me than some light in the sky meandering along. So, on the one hand, we have this popular impression, repeated as recently as a few months ago by an Air Force spokesman, that there isn't anything that affects national security, and Blue Book was it. Well, that's absolute nonsense, and we've had the records to prove that for a long time.
One indication of the Air Force's true view of UFOs was found in this chapter from a military textbook being used at the Air Force Academy in the late 60s. The Air Force was teaching its finest cadets that the UFO phenomenon has been global in nature for 50,000 years, that it is not psychological, that some UFOs appear to be craft controlled by aliens, and that there may be as many as 4 types of aliens visiting this planet. The Air Force's own words. When word of this chapter leaked to the public, it was pulled from the curriculum. Another indication of how seriously UFOs were taken was the level of secrecy assigned by the Pentagon.
And it has been covered up. It was classified higher than the hydrogen bomb back in 1950. And it's still classified way, way above top secret.
One source for this information was Wilbert Smith, one of Canada's leading scientists during the 1950s. In this formerly top-secret memo written for Canada's Department of Transport, Smith revealed that he had had high-level meetings with American scientists concerning UFOs, that flying saucers were real, and that they were classified higher than the H-bomb in the U.S. Smith also indicated that material from crashed saucers had been recovered by the Americans. One of Smith's American contacts was the late Dr. Robert Sarbacher, one of the most respected scientists of this century and a contemporary of Einstein and Oppenheimer. In letters and personal interviews from the early 80s, Sarbacher conceded that he had told Wilbert Smith about recovered saucers and alien bodies, things which, quote, didn't originate on Earth. Sarbacher says he was invited to work on these materials, but never did. He also named several other scientists whom he said were definitely involved, said he'd received briefings on the topic while working at the Pentagon, and that the entire matter was the most classified subject in the U.S. government. Because of Sarbacher's scientific stature, many researchers consider his statements to be the most significant ever made on the UFO topic. The Canadian government wasn't the only one to learn about America's saucer secrets. Former NATO staffer Robert Dean says he read a top-secret briefing document prepared for American allies.
The conclusion of the study was that if there was a program or a hostile purpose here, it would have all been over. They could fly rings around us. They made fools of us in the air. They played games with us on the ground. Case after case after case.
There is a collaboration on above top secret information on this subject between, say, the United States, Great Britain to a certain extent, Canada, Australia. But this is to a limited extent. I don't think the United States has revealed everything it knows to other governments. I'm convinced of that. Many governments haven't the faintest idea what's going on. They have no need to know, and they haven't been filled in.
Why would world governments maintain two attitudes about UFOs? A great concern in private, but ridicule and debunking in public. The answer can be traced to the early 50s.
What is the flying saucer? What do people see and sometimes photograph? What's behind the daily reports of aerial phenomena in the nation's press?
I think it was from outer space, but friendly.
The great UFO wave of 1952 had attracted the attention of the CIA, which was concerned that a foreign power might be able to exploit America's saucer craze. So a panel of scientists was convened to consider UFOs, the so-called Robertson Panel. Members spent a total of 12 hours over 3 days reviewing the UFO evidence and concluded there was nothing to worry about. UFOs were not a threat to national security. However, the continued reporting of UFOs could be a threat, the panel said, and it recommended an official policy of debunking so that flying saucers would be stripped of their aura of mystery. The Robertson panel also recommended that UFO groups and researchers should be monitored. Armed with these recommendations, the CIA and military intelligence agencies swung into action with a plan that is still being carried out. Ridicule those who see UFOs, spy on people who research UFOs, confuse the public with disinformation. For example, plans were drafted to enlist the aid of Walt Disney in belittling the UFO mystery. Popular TV host Arthur Godfrey was also to be recruited. CIA staffers so thoroughly infiltrated the leading UFO organizations of the day that most of them collapsed from within. Attempts were made in the U.S. and other countries to build terrestrial flying saucers, which, if any of them had really worked, would have further confused the public.
You know, there are lots of games being played behind the phenomenon itself. In other words, there is a real phenomenon, but there may be, and here we're talking about the third level, the sociological level. If you could make people expect aliens, you could manipulate public opinion.
High-profile people who take an interest in UFOs, people like former Nashville Councilman George Darden, end up as targets of scorn and laughter. Others, like Linda Howe and Bill Moore, find themselves the targets of government surveillance. The FBI, for instance, has been unwilling to let Moore see the dossier it's compiled on his UFO activities, and some have been warned.
I have been warned by some people that they're paying close attention to you, Stan. And I try to be careful what I do and what I say.
And a lot of people have spilled the beans, but they have been either popularly discredited, so the story doesn't travel. Some have been incarcerated in one way or another, some in mental institutions. Nobody else believes that this is going on. They can tell their neighbors, and the neighbors laugh at them, but it is going on. And it works, and there's only a few that jump the fence, and those few are discredited, and the word doesn't travel too far.
Concerning UFOs,
Clifford Stone had a spotless military record until the summer of 1986, when his Army commanders found out he was writing a book about UFOs. From that point on, Stone says, his life became a living nightmare.
if you have an interest in UFOs and you're writing Freedom of Information Act request and writing various senators, then there has to be something wrong with you. So they set me up for a mental health evaluation. Upon my return from seeing the legal advisor, they had already moved everything out of my office. I had been relieved of duty. They set up an office for me down in the basement. I was not to have any contact with any of the other cadre. As a matter of fact, the other cadre were scared that if they were seen talking to me, that they would be in trouble. They were talking court-martial.
Stone says he developed several high-level military sources who convinced him the cover-up is real.
My executive officer, who started all this, called me in. He told me, he says, what difference does it make to you if we have 50 captured saucers? My response to him was, and I remember this to this day, sir, you have the luxury of not knowing the truth. Unfortunately, I do not share that same luxury.
People with far more clout than Cliff Stone have also been thwarted in their efforts to find out what the military knows about UFOs. During his campaign for president, Jimmy Carter vowed to open all UFO files if he were elected. News articles hinted that Carter was preparing to make an unsettling announcement about UFOs, but it never happened, and to this day, he declines to say why. Senator Barry Goldwater, a former Air Force general who also served as chairman of the Senate Intelligence Committee, would presumably have the power and the clearance to see anything in the military's arsenal. But when Goldwater asked to see the so-called Blue Room, where UFO material is supposedly stored, during a visit to Wright-Patterson Air Base in Ohio, he was told by General Curtis LeMay that it was none of his business and he should never ask again. Former Nevada Senator Howard Cannon is one of Goldwater's closest friends and says he and Goldwater discussed UFOs and the Blue Room several times.
What Barry wanted to do is get in and find out what did they have. What could they say? When you say he was turned down, I'm sure that had I gone to them and said I'd like to go in there, what's the useful purpose? You know, we couldn't come out and talk about that sort of thing and say, well, here's what we saw. First place, somebody would say we're lying, and it would serve no useful purpose, I think.
Cannon, who also was an Air Force general, thinks Congress would have been told if crashed saucers had ever been recovered, but concedes that such secrets could be kept from Congress and the public.
Well, they've kept some pretty good secrets over a period of time, and so I'd have to say that I'd have to believe that secrets like that could be kept.
Getting copies of government UFO documents can also be a daunting task in spite of the Freedom of Information Act. Simply put, if the government doesn't want you to see a file, you won't.
There's no question that agencies of the United States government have been withholding on a regular, clear-cut basis, data about flying saucers, among them the CIA and the National Security Agency.
Today, 99.9% of all UFO government documents are available in the National Archives.
UFO debunkers like Phil Klass somewhat naively assume that the government has no interest in hiding UFO files because there's nothing in them. That view is not borne out by experience. The FBI, for instance, vigorously and repeatedly denied having any UFO files or any interest in the subject. But when the Freedom of Information Act was passed, the G-men reluctantly coughed up 2,000 pages of UFO documents, dating back to the very beginning of the modern UFO era. Write to the CIA to ask for its UFO files, and you'll be told the agency hasn't collected UFO information since the 50s. Yet official documents from the 70s and beyond refer to CIA UFO experts, CIA UFO studies, and the CIA monitoring the UFO situation. Military officials have also been caught telling UFO lies. Both the Air Force and the RAND Corporation denied any knowledge of a secret UFO study commissioned by the Pentagon. Yet, here it is. The RAND study acknowledged the reality of UFOs and said that a solution to the UFO mystery was a matter of the highest urgency.
The National Security Agency, the CIA, Defense Intelligence Agency, FBI, many other agencies are withholding thousands of pages of documents on UFOs in the interest of national security. They admit that. For decades now, since the 1940s, all those agencies I've just referred to have denied any sort of serious involvement in UFO research. So they've been lying to us about that.
In addition to lying about the existence of UFO documents, government agencies routinely censor those UFO files which they are forced to release.
The trouble is, as you start to go through this document, you rather quickly find that a lot of it isn't really there. And I won't stop because you'll see how many pages are really full of good information.
Trying to get files declassified can be all but impossible. Appeals to the FBI, for example, can drag on for 3 to 4 years. The Department of Energy says it could take up to 7 years to obtain some of its sensitive UFO-related material. The National Archives has a backlog of 325 million documents awaiting declassification. Agencies are able to hide behind this log jam, using it as an excuse to withhold or stall the release of UFO information. More disturbing than censorship, false denials, and stall tactics is government-sanctioned disinformation, which seemingly flows back to the CIA's Robertson panel. A recommendation that UFOs be demystified inspired intelligence agencies to muddy the flying saucer waters. Today, there are even officially published rules for how deception programs should be carried out in order to provide cover stories for secret military projects.
Disinformation is a diversion away from the truth. Our method of protecting information is essentially to dilute it with so much garbage that it is extremely difficult for an outsider without access to know what's good and what isn't.
Bill Moore should know all about disinformation efforts. He admits that he was part of one in the 1980s, working hand in hand with Air Force intelligence in a scheme to discredit a UFO researcher, a man who subsequently suffered a mental breakdown. Moore defends his motives.
My involvement was only with the motive of learning